want to talk about shadows for a minute. This is not for an assignment, but the shadows are an important part of making your model look good, and also, especially if you go into rendering, you're going to have to use shadows quite a bit. Shadows can be found under Window, Shadows, and it's its own separate window that comes up. Within the Shadow Settings window, and I've got it fully open. Within the Shadow Settings window, you can control several things. One of the simplest things, one of the things I really like to do is I like to turn on, when I'm working, especially if I'm working inside, I like to turn on Use Sun for shading, because you can actually brighten the model up quite a bit. So if I've got Use Sun for shading, and I think this would probably be better demonstrated if I was looking at something inside. In fact, let's see what it looks like if we go inside this model. I'm just going to go, it's a shell of a house, to be sure. But let's just see what it looks like. Okay, so we're inside a house now. And I'm going to turn off Use Sun for shading. Okay, in a typical model, notice how dark this face is versus how light this face is. And then as you move around, it kind of will start to change that. It'll start to alter that for you, and it'll kind of really give you these dark highlights, dark lowlights, I should say, and high highlights. That's the default look of a SketchUp model. If you turn on Use Sun for shading and then turn up the darkness a little bit, you can actually lighten things up quite a bit. And it will actually, instead of moving it around every time, it'll keep the shadows on one side. So if I move the shadows around, if I move the time of day around, it adjusts or affects what the shadows look like. And I can really lighten the space up to the point where it's almost like blasted with light. Again, it's a little bit better probably better to see how that works in a real model that we've built and put some time into. So we might look at that in the interior model a little bit later. But this is, it's nice to just keep Use Sun for shading on while you're working, just to kind of, so you can see things a little bit cleaner. I'm going to turn that back off now. Now I'm going to turn on the shadows themselves by just clicking on the shadow button. So the other thing you can control, of course, is time of day and time of year, and you can manually type it in, or you can just scroll on that toggle bar. So I've got my time and date that is controlling. So if I'm at noon in the middle of July, the sun will be pretty much right overhead. Now notice that the sun is, when I'm looking at these trees, it's actually giving me a shadow of that whole shape. If I was doing a rendering of this, it'll render the shadow of the tree. It won't actually see this transparent part, which is good, but we'll get into that when we do rendering. You can also control whether or not you have shadows on faces, which of course you want on, or shadows on the ground, which you may or may not. This is not the real ground. This is basically just the ground plane. So if on ground is checked, it's kind of helpful because you can see what shadows are happening below, right? I don't actually have a surface under here, but yeah. So that's kind of all you have to know or worry about that. There are times where you don't want on ground checked because you might have something that's actually underneath the ground. Like let's see what happens if I move this down lower than the ground, and then turn my shadows on the ground on. See that? How these things are kind of floating in space like this? That might not be a desired effect. I might not want to block my view of that. So that might be a time where I would uncheck on ground. Okay, so that's kind of the basic of shadows. The other thing that's really important to know is that the green axis as a default, the one you can actually see, is the north for any model that you've just default added. Unless you have added in a location, but even in that case, it typically brings it in so that the location is, the actual north is pointed up, and that's green. So if I check this by turning my shadows on, and I have them on the ground, I can see that as we're starting out in the morning, the shadows are really dramatic in this direction. But as we move, oh, I'm sorry, that's the date. As we start out in the morning, there's north, so the sun is rising in the east over here, and as the day progresses, it's setting in the west, and gives me those really dramatic shadows at night. So we might want to change north in our model because we might have built something and then realized, okay, well, we spend all this time modeling, And I've also established a bunch of scenes. I don't want to have to turn my model so that it's accurate to where north is. How can I change north and make the north arrow what I want it to be? I will cover that in the next video, which is bringing in an extension called Solar North.